Welcome to this special bonus episode of the Story Nerd Podcast. I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women. Today I'm going to take a look at Don't Worry, Darling, because this is one of my most requested movies. Writers, moviegoers, and actors have all asked me to explain what the heck happened with this film. They've told me that it's weird, that they don't get it, or that it's just stupid. But they can't put their finger on why they hate it so much. For my part, I found it boring. Just plain old boring. But I do know what's wrong with it. And honestly, I think it's an excellent film for writers to study because it's proof of what happens when you don't understand storytelling principles and how they work. Now, the usual spoiler alert is in place because I can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. So, okay, let's just get right into it. In a nutshell, the reason people hate Don't Worry, Darling, and the reason it doesn't work, is that it doesn't follow the basic storytelling principles. And I do mean basic. Like step one, they forgot it. Stories have form, not a formula, but a form. AI will be writing with a formula because it can't do anything else. If you're someone who writes to formula, you're in big trouble. But if you're someone who understands and accepts that stories have form, then you can have a career. If you want someone to read your book all the way to the end, or watch your movie all the way to the end, you've got to respect form. Now, I want to touch on a couple of areas where Don't Worry, Darling missed the fundamentals. And I'll start with the 4 story questions that I've mentioned on a whole bunch of past episodes. And those questions are, who is the protagonist? What does she want? What or who is standing in the way of her getting it? And what happens if she doesn't get it? Okay, so who's the protagonist? Well, it's Alice. That's easy enough. The second question is, what does she want? Now, the want is called an object of desire. Melanie and I talk about this concept all of the time. And actually, you know what? I might even do a whole season on it because it's that important. What we've got to do is establish the want as quickly as possible because our reader needs to know what the story is about. The audience's expectation is that the story is about a protagonist going after what she wants. Okay, so there's 2 things there right away that I need to talk about. First, Alice does not have a clear want. In fact, for the first 45 minutes or so of this 2-hour movie, Alice doesn't want anything at all. It's only when Margaret kills herself that Alice acquires an object of desire, and that, of course, is that she wants to know what happened to her friend. In the first 20 minutes or so, nothing happens, and I do mean nothing. All of that time is spent establishing the world, but it isn't a complicated world to establish. And because nothing is happening, we lose interest really quickly. I paused the movie at 18 minutes, and I'll be honest, I would have turned it off entirely and abandoned the whole thing much earlier than 18 minutes, but I was watching it for work, so I had to somehow get all the way to the end. The second thing that I want to point out is that the audience's expectation is that the story is about a protagonist going after what she wants. All right, let me finish the 4 questions first, and then I'm going to circle back to that because it's important. We have to understand it. So Alice is the protagonist, and she has no object of desire at all for the first half of the movie. Because of that, there isn't really a force of antagonism or any stakes for the first half of the movie either. Now, remember the 4 questions. Who is the protagonist? What does she want? What's standing in the way of her getting it? That's the force of antagonism. And what happens if she doesn't get it? That's the stakes. And there isn't really a force of antagonism or any stakes in the first half of this movie. Oh, sure, Frank is like creepy. But the antagonist's job is to get in the way of the protagonist as she tries to achieve her object of desire. That's what creates conflict, and conflict is interesting. If your story does not have conflict, it's not working. Because Alice doesn't want anything, Frank isn't an effective antagonist. He's just a creepy dude. Alrighty, audiences' expectations. This, I believe, is the biggest problem with this movie. Back in season 5, I talked about the shape of stories, again using Robert McKee's work as my guide. There are 3 basic shapes. Those of you who heard season 5 will remember this. It's arc plot, mini plot, and anti-plot. As I've said many times before, the vast majority of audiences pick up a book or sit down to watch a movie expecting an arc plot story. Arc plot form is what 99% of us think of when we think of a story. So when a book or a movie veers from that, the reader or viewer has to adjust their expectations on the fly. Now, they can do it with a mini plot story pretty easily, actually, because it's a lot closer to an arc plot story than an anti-plot story is. All right, so here's a refresher of the qualities of an arc plot story. It has a plot line with clear causality, which means something happens because something else happened. It has a closed ending, a linear timeline, primarily external conflict, a single active protagonist, and a consistent reality. Anti-plot stories, however, don't have any of those things. And therefore, it's really tempting to say that Don't Worry, Darling is an anti-plot story, because it doesn't have those things either. But as I cautioned in season 5, the anti-plot form isn't an excuse to just put any old crap in a book or a screenplay and call it a story or art. Anti-plot means anti-structure. Storytelling principles are being disregarded intentionally for very specific reasons. According to McKee, quote, anti-plot doesn't reduce the arc plot form, but reverses it, contradicting traditional forms to exploit, perhaps ridicule, the very idea of formal principles. The vast majority of human beings cannot endorse the inconsistent realities of anti-plot, the internalized passivity of mini-plot, and the static circularity of non-plot as metaphors for the life they live in. He continues to say that anti-plot stories are, quote, worlds in which not only are events atemporal, coincidental, fragmented, and chaotic, but characters do not operate within a recognizable psychology. Neither sane nor insane, they are either deliberately inconsistent or overtly symbolic. Films in this mode are not metaphors for life as lived, but for life as thought about. They reflect not reality, but the solipsism of the filmmaker, and in doing so, stretches the limits of story design toward didactic and ideational structures. So, all of this to say that arc plot story forms make sense to us. Anti-plot story forms do not make sense to us. But again, Don't Worry, Darling is not an anti-plot, although it's tempting to think that it is. Don't Worry, Darling is a story that does not work because it has, it hasn't implemented the basic principles of storytelling. But it's like it's not even aware that basic principles of storytelling exist. It really isn't. So one of the biggest problems here is that Don't Worry, Darling has ignored the audience's expectation for a plot line with clear causality. Now, what that means is that you set stuff up and then you pay the stuff off. Nothing has been set up here. Random things happen and we don't know why. They don't lead to anything and they don't happen because of anything else. And that's really irritating. Like, really irritating. It feels like your time is being wasted. That's what it feels like. There's a concept in storytelling that says that you don't introduce anything new after Act 2. And there's a reason for that. It's so the plot line will make logical sense. You set the stuff up in the beginning, you pay it off at the end. But again, don't worry, darling, didn't set anything up. So as I watch this thing for the second time, yes, the second time, I'm not watching it a third time. Here's a laundry list of just a bunch of random unexplained events that I jotted down as I was watching the movie, and these are in no particular order, okay? Here we go. It's quite a list. Why does Frank's wife stab him? Where do these guys in red come from? We see Alice with the empty eggs, but it's never brought up again, and after that moment, Alice herself seems to have forgotten about them. Why does Frank say that he has hope for Alice? Alice doesn't have an object of desire. I don't know why. Frank does not seem to have an object of desire. Like, what's this all for anyway? Why does Alice let Frank watch her and Jack have sex? What's the significance of the red airplane? Now, we know that Margaret's son had one, and Margaret had one. In fact, she has her son's toy plane, presumably. And we know that Alice sees a red airplane, which looks just like the toy. It crashes out in the desert. But why is there a red airplane at all? Like, what's up with it? Who's in the airplane? What does it symbolize? What does it signify? What does it trigger? What does it say to the audience? When the audience sees the red airplane, it's supposed to have meaning for us because that meaning would have been set up, but it doesn't. Why is Jack promoted? At the dinner party toward the end of the movie, why doesn't Alice deny that she and Frank had sex? Why doesn't she clarify that he watched her and Jack having sex? Frank says that he hopes Alice can challenge him, but how? What is she doing that's any different than what Margaret did? How is it that Alice is suddenly able to put all of the pieces of the puzzle together at the dinner party? What is it that tipped her off? I mean, the audience is totally confused, and we are supposed to have the same information that Alice has, but we don't. And we don't have any indication that somewhere along the line, Alice picked up on something that we didn't pick up on. The citizens of this fictional world, this virtual world, all have the same stories. Now, this seems like a flaw in the virtual system. I mean, did the programmers really only create 3 scenarios? Did they not think that the citizens of this virtual world would talk and would connect the dots? So, like, really? How does Alice know that she has been told her memories? Why do things start exploding after Alice kills Jack? Jack is not the first character to die in this virtual world. Margaret died too, and nothing happened then. Why is it that all of the wives suddenly understand what's happening when Alice walks out of her house after having killed Jack? Why does Alice pause when she reaches headquarters at the very end? She got to that building long before the guys chasing her, and she had plenty of time to escape before the men in red caught her. That's quite a laundry list of things that make no sense, and I know that I missed a whole lot of things. So for an audience who is anticipating a single active protagonist, a plot line with clear causality, and a consistent fictional reality, Don't Worry, Darling is an exercise in frustration. I am not at all surprised to hear viewers say that they didn't enjoy the movie. And if you don't have a really strong handle on the fundamentals of storytelling, your reader isn't going to enjoy your book or your screenplay either. I want you to pause here for a minute and just see if you can list the storytelling fundamentals in your mind. I'll give you 10 seconds here and just list as many of them as you can. Okay, if you had trouble with that exercise, if you couldn't just rattle them all off, you need to do more study. Remember, AI is chasing you. It's chasing me too. I'm very aware of it. The bar is higher now for us than it has ever been. And that's why I'm putting together a series of webinars. The first one is on the basic principles of storytelling. I want you to have the information you need. So you can go to valeriefrancis.ca/webinars and enter your email address, and then I will notify you when the webinar is ready to go. Alrighty, that wraps it up for this bonus episode of the Story Nerd Podcast. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on X, Instagram, and Threads at Valerie_Francis. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.